So comparison has always been one of my biggest defects. As an artist in recovery, it was one of my biggest defects when I was in active addiction. And now it's one of my biggest defects in recovery. You know, for me, in my experience, I find that the grass is always greener on the other side or in the neighbour's garden or whatever expression you have in your home country. You know, and sometimes I find myself wanting two things that couldn't possibly coexist. You know, I couldn't, you know, two events that are just impossible to happen at the same time. Yet I find that my mind wants to have both of those things at once. You know, a bit of greed involved in that as well. Today I want to talk about like how comparing ourselves to other people is wrong as creative people in recovery. I want to talk about like comparing myself to this kind of rock and roll mentality, you know, addict artist, addict musician, addict writer was really, really detrimental to my own well-being generally. And it really led to a dangerous path of, addiction and self-abuse, I would say. I'm going to talk about the paradox of wanting these conflicting lives simultaneously, which is a massive one for me. And it's something I really need to talk about and get off my chest and just blow myself up for in this video, whilst also hopefully helping you. And then thirdly, like how sobriety and recovery can reframe comparison and how we can use our own recovery and creative recovery journeys as a bit of a spark for something different to the norm, you know. The peace that comes from living on our own paths, the peace that comes from living authentically, the peace that comes from looking at our own selves instead of looking at everybody else. You know, and I'm not by no means perfect at doing that, but you know, this is what it's all about, innit? We got to give it a go. So yeah, this comparison trap, which I've touched on, it really, you know, ruined not only my creativity but my life for a long time. I used to compare myself to all these famous rock and roll addicts, you know, and that used to be my biggest goal in life, was to achieve that kind of stardom through overconsumption. And it was a bit like, if I'm not partying and drinking and using drugs most days of the week, then am I really an artist? Because all my favourite artists, musicians, writers and actors are all completely wild, deranged, party animals, and are fully involved in this hedonistic lifestyle. And so that was me comparing myself to other people, whilst also forgetting that these people were mentally ill, these people were suicidal, these people did commit suicide, they died of overdoses, they led lonely existences on the fringes of normal society, despite the stardom that they accrued through their musical or otherwise talents. And yeah, you know, it really nearly was the end of me. And these days I don't compare myself to those people because I know that that's not a healthy way to live my life. But in the past, when I was unwell myself, when I was living in my own insanity, that seemed like a very appealing way of life, you know, caring about nothing, but really caring about everything too much, you know, using drink and drugs to change my mind because I didn't like what was going on in my own head. And I know that that's very relatable for a lot of creative people in recovery, and there is still really this sort of thing about being an artist in recovery, you know. Being an artist generally, it's that you need to be sort of crazy or an addict in some way or another, and that comparison is really not helpful, you know. And so secondly, I want to discuss like this paradox of wanting conflicting lives simultaneously, because I know, like, even now in recovery, with 5.5 years under my belt in recovery and 3.5 years working full-time as a professional artist, sometimes my head convinces me that I want two totally opposite things, but I want them simultaneously, you know. So like a very relevant example at the moment, which I just can't get my head around, is the idea that simultaneously I want to like be promiscuous, but I also want to be settled down with a nice partner and a family and some children, you know, get married and all that kind of more quote unquote normal life stuff. And the truth is, like, I don't know if I'm ready for either of those things, and that's important to acknowledge. It's like, as addicts, creative addicts in particular, we're always like towing this line between our mind telling us one thing and then telling us completely the opposite thing, and trying to like navigate between those two things. And in that example I just used, my own current insanity that I'm battling with is like, if you break it down, it's kind of like this freedom versus stability, and that's been a huge issue of mine on my own recovery journey, because part of me still feels like that old life that I used to live of hedonism and rock and roll is quote unquote free, and this life I have now is like quote unquote not free. It's too structured, it's too constrained, I don't get to do whatever I want to do whenever I want to do it. And again, comparing myself to all these alternate versions of me, none of which are actually the real version of me. I'm not promiscuous, I'm not settled down, I'm just where I am right now. And so these comparisons are really unhelpful for me, because they stop me from focusing on where I am truly at in this moment, the authentic version of myself. Because reality is, I'm not promiscuous right now, I'm not married right now, I don't have children, and where I am right now is where I am right now, and that's okay. I don't need to compare what my life is up to with anybody else's, even though I do all the time, unfortunately. Work in progress. Done is better than perfect. It's practice over perfection, isn't it? That's always the case in recovery. And then thirdly, sobriety reframes comparison. Peace really does come from living on our own paths, and that's really important for me to acknowledge. It's been my experience, it hasn't come quickly, it hasn't come easily, it hasn't come without great struggle. But, now I feel like, even though I've got these issues going on that I just mentioned previously, amongst many other problems, I'm much better than I was 5.5 years ago. Hands down. There's so many things now, so many structures in my life that I've created whilst on my own recovery journey that keep me much safer, much saner than I was before. And they allow me to be authentic in ways that I never was when I was using drink and using drugs every day. Because no matter what anybody says, if you are using mind-altering substances regularly, you are not comfortable in your own mind, and therefore you need to change it to feel comfortable. So, we can't create authentically if we're living in somebody else's story. We can't create authentically if we're trying to be somebody else, trying to impress somebody else, trying to live like somebody else or act like somebody else, or achieve the things that other people are achieving. The only authentic path we've got is our own. And, being in recovery has given me that permission to write my own story, to live my own life. And as I mentioned before, I'm all about being truthful. I'm nowhere near fixed, I'm nowhere near perfect. I'm on my own journey, I'm still on my own journey. I'm very much in the trenches a lot of the time, trying to navigate like who I am, what I want, where I want to go. And it takes daily work, that's the truth. It's not easy. But, 5.5 years down the line, it has gotten better. And that's key, I've discussed it in previous videos. Consistency is better than perfection. And so just showing up in whatever way I've been able to on the kind of daily, near daily kind of framework, then, it has gotten better, that's for sure. So yeah, let me know if any of that has been useful. Let me know if it's not been useful and what might be useful. I'm always open to hearing what people want to hear me talk about. Do you struggle with comparison in recovery? Is there something that you're comparing yourself to? Is there somebody else that you're comparing yourself to? Is there a lifestyle, a kind of, artificial version of reality that you're comparing yourself to? Let me know. I would love to know. What we're getting up to in the community on school, which is Creating Sobriety, is trying to just connect with each other authentically and dispel the need to be comparing ourselves all the time. So if you feel like you want to be in a place with other creative people who struggle with addiction, struggle with mental health, and even struggle with recovery, if you're in recovery, because I know I struggle with it sometimes, then Creating Sobriety is for you. So yeah, if you've enjoyed this video, give it a like, give it a subscribe, let me know. Much appreciated, and see you in the next one.